will, believe it or not, change the world. And until I know I can trust you completely, I will simply leave you to tinker with your outdated and misguided methods." "If you really believe that," Reed asked, "then why bring me on board in the first place? Why do you even want me here? From time to time, we'll need the expertise of someone like yourself. But more than that, when you realize what it is we're doing here, I'm hopeful you will see the potential we have and commit yourself to the cause." "Then tell me what the cause is," Reed said. "How can I commit to something I'm not aware of?" Templeton just smiled. "In time," he said, infuriating Reed even further. "Prove yourself first. Then all will be made clear." "And how exactly am I supposed to prove myself?" "Continue your work for now," Templeton answered. "And, when the time comes, do not disappoint." Dr. Reed raised his eyebrows in surprise. Director Templeton was much older than he was, shorter too, and supposedly a man of God. But Reed was almost certain the old man had just issued him a veiled threat. Templeton then patted him on the shoulder and walked off towards his office, leaving Reed dumbfounded. Chapter 5. Adrian looked down at the beaten and bloodied man. His pitiful face had already begun to swell and bruise. He spat blood, and some of it coated Adrian's shoes. "Say it," Adrian seethed, fists still clenched. "Say it to me now." The man crawled forward like a dog and grabbed at Adrian's ankle. This man was his father, someone who, over the years, had beaten and abused both Adrian and Adrian's mother. He'd worn them down to hollow shells of the people they once were, snuffing out the people they could have been. But Adrian was bigger now, an adult in his own right, and he'd finally had enough. So in the dark and dingy home, one that his father had stripped of warmth over the years, Adrian erupted. After being called a worthless mistake yet again, he snapped and assaulted the old drunken monster, smashing his fists into his father's face. The suddenness and ferocity of Adrian's attack overwhelmed his father, who made a futile attempt to fight back. Adrian's mother screamed at him to stop, telling him not to go too far. But when the man fell, Adrian unleashed a flurry of kicks to his father's head and watched as the cartilage of the man's nose crumpled and splintered. Expelling all of his pent-up rage felt good, exhilarating even. So he kept going, indulging in the violence and taking a kind of sadistic glee in the power he felt, making the man suffer who had caused him such anguish. "Say it to me now!" Adrian screamed again. "I dare you!" He wanted his father to beg for forgiveness and plead for his life. Instead, the old bastard simply looked up at him with his one good eye and spluttered out his reply. "Worthless fucking mistake," he said, managing a pained smile. Despite Adrian's mother's protests, Adrian allowed himself to fully embrace the anger that fueled him. He grabbed the man by the throat and squeezed with all he was worth. His father fought back, a pathetic and weak attempt, but soon his face went from being beet red to a shade of blue, and his eyes bulged from the sockets. With a wheeze, his life was finally choked away. "Good," a voice said, as the walls around Adrian started to change. They peeled and flaked away to reveal a world outside that was not his own. A nightmarish place. He heard his mother's terrified cries as something took her, a twisted, monstrous being, and crushed her skull. Adrian screamed. Adrian was pulled from unconsciousness and back into reality. It took him a moment to realize why. The asylum was never exactly a quiet place. The cries and moans of residents around the facility were a constant background noise that took him days to get used to after he first arrived. But the noises that woke him now were different. Something was happening. Adrian lifted his head from the hard pillow and stared over to the closed door of his room, as if doing so could help visualize just what was going on in the hallways beyond. But it didn't help, because while he could understand and make sense of some noises he heard, panicked yelling and angry shouts, there was another, terrifying sound that made no sense to him at all. It seemed inhuman. Guttural groans and roars that were unfamiliar to him. The sounds were getting closer now, and were punctuated by a howl of someone in tremendous pain. That was followed by some kind of gurgling and spluttering. The chaos of what was happening in the corridor moved closer, and was soon outside of his room. Something clashed against the sturdy metal door, hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. More pained cries, and then the viewing hatch was knocked open. Mouth agape, Adrian gazed out into the darkness, not daring to move. The noises outside plateaued, and he could hear somebody struggling, desperately gasping and groaning. Whoever this man was, his pained pleas were soon overwhelmed by a monstrous growl. Adrian was terrified, but he was also desperate to know what was going on. Surely the thick door between them would keep him safe from harm. He got to his feet, and ever so slowly made his way over to the now open hatch. He heard a horrible crunch from beyond, and yet another cry of agony, then a prolonged ripping sound as the cries heightened before blurring into a wet gurgle. Adrian reached the hatch and carefully peered out. Before he had the chance to take anything in, a blood-covered face slammed into the opening, causing him to yell and jump back in shock. Adrian looked at the terrified face in repulsion. This man was one of the asylum's orderlies, but it was hard to be sure as to which because his jaw was completely missing. It had been ripped off, leaving jagged wounds and exposed red flesh and tendons beneath. His tongue lolled down through the door's hatch and into Adrian's room. It writhed and twitched, almost with a life of its own. Adrian made eye contact with the orderly, but immediately regretted doing so. The eyes seemed to plead for help, but the only sounds the man could make were incomprehensible moans. As quickly as it appeared, the face was yanked away, and Adrian heard more growls, then a pained, high-pitched cry. He was scared, but couldn't help himself. Adrian slowly moved forward and peered out to see the dark corridor beyond. He could make out a tall, spindly figure in the darkness, holding what appeared to be the orderly's head in its long, claw-like hands, as the detached body was dropped carelessly to the floor. Whatever this thing was, it was almost 7 feet tall, and its skin was pulled tight over oddly shaped bones that protruded beneath. Adrian drew in a sharp gasp of breath as fear gripped him further. And as he did, it appeared the demonic thing outside heard him. While still holding the severed head, it turned, allowing Adrian to see its face, melted and warped, the features like that of some horrific painting. One eye hung considerably lower than the other, almost in line with the corner of its unnaturally wide mouth, which opened like that of a snake, revealing rows of long, serrated teeth. The edges of its thin lips turned up into a smile as it raised the detached head up and pushed it into its open maw. The demon made a sound reminiscent of a chuckle as the jaws clamped down over the cranium and started to exert force. It didn't take long for the head to crunch and compress, eventually popping completely, causing a shower of gore and grey brain matter to burst free. Another sound came from the tall, gangly thing outside of Adrian's room. It was a kind of huffing, snorting noise. The thing's shoulders bobbed up and down, and its smile increased as it began to chew. Adrian realized that it was laughing. Then Adrian heard approaching voices, and he turned to look farther back down the corridor. In the distance, he could see bodies littering the floor, other orderlies who had met a similar fate as their friend. The approaching group seemed to be coming from that direction, but had not arrived in full view as yet. The chewing, demonic thing outside evidently heard the same voices and running footsteps too, as it turned in the same direction. It began to backpedal, but before running off into the darkness completely, it cast Adrian one last look. It may have just been Adrian's imagination after seeing something so horrific, but he was sure he recognized a familiarity in that melted, twisted face. Malcolm? Adrian heard the monster's thumping footsteps move down the corridor as it fled. A group of orderlies finally emerged, sprinting after the thing, armed with knives, koshes, and sticks. And one of them had a different kind of weapon altogether. In his hands he gripped a thin pipe that was fitted with handles and a nozzle at the end. A rubber tube ran from the back of the shaped metal pipe and connected to a small tank that was strapped to the man's back. From the end of the nozzle, Adrian saw a small blue flame. Could that weapon really be what he thought it was? If so, why the hell did an asylum need to be equipped with something like that? "Get it!" an orderly yelled as they sprinted in a huddled group down the narrow hallway. One orderly bringing up the rear saw Adrian's open hatch and locked eyes with him through it. The man quickly slammed the cover shut, cutting off Adrian's view of what was happening. Adrian then heard the voices and clattering footsteps disappear as they moved further away. It seemed the chase was on. Adrian stood before his door in silent disbelief. What had he just seen? And could that thing have really been Malcolm? Unable to make sense of it, he eventually made his way back over to his bed and dropped down onto it. He lay back and pulled his knees up to his chest, feeling himself shaking with fear and adrenaline. He listened, trying to make out any sounds in the distance that would give him a clue as to what was going on, and he could hear wild cries, screams and roars. Whatever was happening, Adrian knew there was violence involved. And amongst all of that, the patients in the facility seemed particularly agitated tonight, as their mad bellows were also clearly audible. Adrian had no idea of the hour, but he knew he would not sleep again that night. Chapter 6. It was late, but Reed couldn't sleep. He was seated in his office, a rather small, cramped room, which housed his chair and writing desk in the center, spare chair near the door, and tall bookcases lining the walls. Each case was crammed full of files and medical journals, while the desk itself was a sea of loose papers, parchment, and notes. As precise and meticulous as he believed he was, his office was in stark contrast to that. Organized chaos was how he liked to describe it, with more emphasis on the chaos than the organized. He was trying to focus on the job at hand, of writing up a report on a patient. Reed had a treatment in mind for the man, and it was the same treatment that had derailed his career and landed him in this god-forsaken place, though it was not the report that was keeping him awake. The altercation with Director Templeton was playing on his mind, specifically the things the man had said to him. Prove yourself. Do not disappoint. All vague riddles and threats, with nothing of substance behind them. What the hell was expected of him here? He tried to concentrate on the words he was scribbling in his ledger, as his eyes had started to ache with tiredness, but he knew it was pointless trying to rest them, as his mind was just too active. To help, he had switched off the light in his office and was now writing by the gentle, flickering glow of his table-mounted lantern. He'd owned the lamp for many years, even brought it with him when he'd started at Arlington Asylum, and found that the soft hue it gave off was much more forgiving on his eyes than the sharp illumination from the electric lights fitted throughout the facility. It also usually helped his mind to settle. But not tonight. He was not the kind of man to take kindly to threats, obscure or not. "Ignore the old fool," Reed said to himself. "Concentrate on your work. Then you can leave this place behind forever." He tried doing just that and went back to a report which outlined the treatment he was planning to try on one of his patients, a young man, only 17, who had been picked up after living on the streets. He suffered from fits of violence, and with no warning he would erupt and lash out at anyone around him. Afterwards, when the episodes subsided, he always showed great regret for his actions, and Reed felt that he was the perfect candidate to try the procedure on again, the one that had almost ruined him last time. It was less of a risk now. If he failed, no one would care. He could simply try again. Not like the last time, with Elton Breyer. The procedure that was supposed to push him into fame and renown had not gone as expected. Elton had been tied down to Reed's table, fully awake and cognizant. Reed knew exactly what he had to do and how much pressure to exert, but knowing something and actually carrying it out were two different things. Reed remembered taking hold of the instrument, which was long and thin with a sharp end and made of lightweight aluminium, and bringing it down to the inside corner of Elton's left eye. The young man's blue irises had looked up at him as he did, wide with fear at the approaching pick. Reed felt the instrument slip in beside the wet eyeball and could see the fleshy orb push slightly to the side, making room for the new object that had invaded its space. Reed had then brought up a mallet and started to gently hammer the pick into Elton's head. It had slipped inside easily, moving down farther and farther until Reed had felt resistance. He had reached the brain. With a steady hand, he had hammered the pick again and penetrated the rubbery matter. Elton had let out a moan, and his body had begun to convulse. Reed had kept hitting the instrument, pushing it down farther, and Elton's convulsions had become more severe. Finally, Reed had stopped, keeping the pick in place at what he thought was the correct depth. Then he had gently moved it from side to side, hoping to successfully sever the connections to the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobes of the brain. This procedure, known as a transorbital lobotomy, should have put an end to Elton's violent episodes and made him much more docile. Whilst not conceived or developed by Reed himself, it was still considered an untested and unpracticed procedure, and therefore looked down upon by the stuffy old medical elite, especially here in England. However, it was much easier and simpler to perform than a conventional lobotomy, saving time and money, and Reed had ambitions of taking this idea and pushing it to become common practice in his home country, and collecting all the plaudits that were owed to him as he did. But things had not worked out that way. Instead, Elton had died on his table, and Dr. Thomas Reed's promising career had gone into freefall. But he was determined to prove that the procedure was not only viable, but also the best way to treat most mental ailments, which meant he needed to try again. And he'd scheduled his first reattempt for the very next day. If successful, he intended to try again and again and hone the procedure until he was able to carry it out flawlessly, each and every time. Then he could leave Arlington Asylum behind, and the clueless Isaac Templeton, a religious idiot playing at medicine, could go to hell. Reed dropped his pen and let out a sigh. That was enough for tonight. While he was a man who did not need a lot of sleep to operate well, he was in danger of overdoing it and leaving himself too exhausted tomorrow to be at his best. And when he was overly tired, Reed tended to think of his wife and son, and he could ill afford to let himself do that. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Time for sleep, at least for a few hours, and even if sleep did not come, he could at least rest his tired eyes. He then got to his feet and turned off the lantern before leaving his office and locking it securely behind him. Like every other area of the asylum, his personal quarters were just off the main hall. That area acted as a hub, and the other wards were connected to this central section like the arms running from the head of an octopus. The building itself was all single-story, with no stairs or elevators to speak of. Though that wasn't true, was it? There was an old-looking service elevator at the back of the main hall, one that Reed was not allowed to use. He knew it went down, but to where he had no clue, and Templeton would not tell him. Secrets upon secrets, in a structure that almost seemed designed to be hidden from the world, sunken into a surrounding forest, with only one road in and out. A road that was not much travelled anymore. Hell, even the administrative staff who worked in the main hall seemed to live on site. At times this place felt more like a prison than a place of work. He was allowed to leave, but excursions needed to be arranged with Templeton, who held the key, and it was made clear that the facility was not to be discussed with anyone outside of its own walls. Another threat from Templeton. This one followed with a promise of expulsion. And given that Arlington seemed to be his last chance at professional redemption, Reed could ill afford to go against the director. Reed made his way towards the main hall, savouring the quiet. At this time of night, things were usually silent in the area, the cries of the insane insulated to their own wards. And he expected that tonight would be no different. But as he got closer to the main hall, he heard it. Voices. Screams. They were panicked, and as he got closer he could make out the sounds of a struggle. Screams bellowed, and muffled orders were barked out. Above it all, a horrific screech. Reed stopped, not knowing if he should run back or continue forward. Curiosity got the better of him, and he jogged onwards. What on earth could make a sound like that? His first instinct was that there was an animal loose in the asylum. How that had happened he had no idea, but what else could explain it? He reached the blank iron door that separated the zone he was in from the main hall and unlocked it. Whatever was happening beyond seemed to be in full flow. He gently pushed the door open, just in time to hear an ear-piercing scream as someone wailed in agony. Reed peeked through the opening and could scarcely believe his own eyes. A group of orderlies had surrounded something and were trying in vain to subdue it. They seemed to be failing in their efforts, however, and Reed saw who it was that was crying out in agony. One of the orderlies was without his arm, and blood pumped freely from the stump at his shoulder. The severed appendage was on the floor, close to the creature that they had all surrounded, and Reed had no idea what it was. Humanoid in shape, certainly, with arms, legs, a torso and head, but it was not human. First of all, it was far too tall, and its limbs were stick-thin. It evidently possessed a power that belied its slight build, however, having pulled a man's arm clean off. Reed was too far away to make out its face or finer features, but its thin skin looked to be black, or at least dark purple. Reed then saw Jones run into the room, coming from Ward A. "What do we do?" one of the other orderlies yelled, desperate for help and instruction, clearly at a loss as to how best to handle a situation such as this. Jones circled round to another of the men who was equipped with a strange weapon, one that was connected to a metallic tank on his back. Jones relieved the man of the instrument and quickly put it on himself. "We kill it," he said. "But what about the director? Will he allow us to do that?" asked another. Jones raised the end of the weapon and aimed it at the feet of the approaching beast. "I'll explain it to Templeton," Jones said, before a stream of orange and yellow liquid flame burst free from the metal nozzle. The creature was immediately engulfed in searing fire that swam up its body, coating it completely. The monster roared and screeched and continued to run towards Jones. The orderly, however, was not easily fazed and circled the creature before letting loose with another burst from the weapon. Flames engulfed it completely now, so fierce that Reed could barely make out the black of its skin beneath the yellow and red flames. Eventually, the thing's screams faded, and it dropped to the floor, lifeless. The smell of burning meat flooded the air. "Give it a minute," Jones commanded in a confident voice. "Then put the fire out. I'll go and speak with the director." "The changes are getting worse," one of the orderlies said, as the others rushed to the aid of the man who'd been stripped of an arm. "We can't go on like this." "We can, and we will," Jones replied, taking off the weapon and thrusting it into the arms of the complaining man. "We're all here for a reason, and that reason doesn't change. If anyone has ideas about leaving, they'll answer to me. Understand?" No one presented an argument. Satisfied, Jones walked away from the room, leaving his colleagues to put out the fire before it spread further. Reed quietly pulled the door closed before he was seen. His mind struggled to comprehend what he'd just witnessed. Monsters did not exist. He was a man of science, unwavering in his beliefs, so how did he reconcile his mind with what his own eyes had just shown him? He felt his heart beating quickly in his chest and realized he was sweating. A nervous energy flooded him, and something else concerned him as well, something an orderly had said after they put the creature down. "The changes are getting worse." It was clear from what was said that Director Templeton was aware, at least to some extent, of what was going on here. Reed knew he needed answers, and resolved to confront Templeton about this as soon as he could. He headed back to his office in a daze, and decided to stay there for the night. First thing tomorrow morning he would pay the director a visit. He fell into his seat and dropped his head into his hands. Just what in the hell had he gotten himself involved in? Chapter 7. The very next day, after a night without any sleep, Reed saw Director Templeton enter the administration ward and make his way straight to the chapel, which was a morning routine for the director. It was here Reed planned to confront Templeton about what he'd seen the previous night. The image of that inhuman thing, and what it had done to that orderly, had stuck with Reed ever since he'd witnessed it. Reed had used the time throughout the night to try to explain just what it was he'd seen, and the best he could come up with was that the thing was indeed human, but had somehow transformed or mutated. He'd skimmed through his medical books in his office to try to find a known condition that could explain such a transformation, but had come up empty-handed. Nothing could explain what he'd seen. At least, nothing that he was aware of. However, he had a feeling that Templeton may have a little more knowledge of what was going on around here. Reed opened the door to the chapel and stepped inside to see the director seated in one of the rows of pews at the front of the room. The walls here were white plaster, and on their surfaces were pictures and effigies of biblical figures. The ceiling was not as high as in other areas of the building, and the floor was an ugly white tile, giving the room quite an underwhelming feel. On either side of a central aisle, rows of uncomfortable-looking wooden pews stretched back from the front. At the head of these seats was a simple altar, a table covered in white cloth. This shrine housed a large, ornamental crucifix that stood centrally, with an open Bible beneath it. Either side of the thick book burned sticks of incense, filling the whole room with a pleasant aroma of jasmine. Other than the assorted ornaments and effigies, the only other thing of note was a large mirror, which was affixed to one of the walls. Whether this room had always served as a chapel, or whether it had been converted for such a purpose, Reed did not know. Nor did he care. Templeton did not hear him enter, or made no show of being aware of his presence, and continued to sit with his head bowed. Reed made his way over to the director, walking down the central aisle, and took a seat next to him. "I never took you for a religious man," Templeton said with his eyes closed. "Care to join me in prayer?" "No," Reed answered. "I'm not one for superstition or make-believe." Templeton let out a small laugh. "To each his own." "At least," Reed went on, "I thought I believed that. I was certain that all things supernatural, including demons and monsters and the like, were just made-up stories, the product of a weak or retarded mind." "It sounds like you may have had a change of heart," Templeton said. His voice was flat and unreadable, and still he did not open his eyes. "Hard to say," Reed said, letting some of the frustration he was feeling show through in his tone. "But after last night and what I saw, I don't know what to think anymore." "Is that right?" Templeton showed no emotion at all, other than perhaps a slight amused curiosity, which only angered Reed more. "Yes," he said, "that is right. And do you have any idea what it is I saw?" "Does it matter?" the director asked, the question throwing Reed off his train of thought. "If you saw something that has made you question the very beliefs you held as sacred, then surely there's a more important question to be answered." "Really? And what would be more important than getting to the bottom of it? You don't think the truth is important?" Now Templeton opened his eyes, and he turned to face Reed. "Oh no," he said, "do not misunderstand. The truth is the only important thing in our lives. But I'm afraid people cling to truth that are, in fact, outright lies, and they live their lives never actually knowing real truth, just as you have been doing." Reed shook his head. "More riddles? Really?" "Not riddles, Thomas," Templeton said, using Reed's Christian name. "I'm simply asking a valid question. You say you saw something that has perhaps changed the way you view the world. Instead of contemplating that and what it means to you, you rush to me for answers, but you need to provide your own." "I'm getting tired of all this vague rubbish you spout, director," Reed said, raising his voice. But Templeton just shrugged. "Then do not ask anything of me. Go about your business." "Go about my business?" Reed was yelling now, and he got to his feet, looking down at the other man. "Do you know what I saw last night? I saw something in the main hall that was, as far as I could tell, not human, roaming around, attacking the people that work here. And in the end, it was put down by a weapon that has no business being kept in a place like this. Yet there it was, spraying its flame and killing whatever the hell that thing was. A little coincidental that such a thing was here when needed. No? And I know that you know something about it because the men practically said as much. Now I want you to give me some straight answers for once and tell me what the fuck is going on here." Calmly, Director Templeton rose to his feet and looked Reed directly in the eyes. "No," he said simply and smiled. Then he turned to leave. Yet again, Reed could not believe the audacity of the man. "What do you mean, no? That isn't an acceptable answer," Reed said. "I'm afraid it's the only one you're getting," Templeton shot back. "Not good enough. If you don't explain this to me, then I'm leaving this place for good. You'll be on your own here." "That seems fair," Templeton said. "I'm sure you'll find a plethora of opportunities just waiting for you when you do. Best of luck for the future." "I want answers, Templeton!" Reed screamed. Templeton reached the door to the room and turned back to face Reed. "Then find them, Doctor. I'm not stopping you." "Find them? Why not just tell me?" "Because truths that are given and not earned are not really valued. What we're doing here is hard to accept. We're learning truths about the things that govern our reality, our very existence, something that transcends your science." At this, Reed had a realization. He looked around the room they were in, the one Templeton visited every morning, and then at the robes Templeton always wore. "God," Reed said. "This is something to do with God, isn't it? What, you think you're somehow able to communicate with him?" Templeton let out a loud laugh and shook his head. "I'm afraid you haven't got it worked out just yet, Thomas. But keep looking. The truth will reveal itself to you. I have faith in that." And then he exited the room. "God damn it," Reed huffed. His attempt to extract the truth from Templeton had left him feeling more confused than ever. No answers, only more frustration. Then he remembered what Templeton had told him about answers. Find them. I'm not stopping you. Fair enough, Reed thought to himself, intending to do just that. Chapter 8. Adrian and his group, Jack, Trevor, Sean and Seymour, were all seated in the communal area yet again. It was a change to the four walls of his room, but was fast losing its appeal. Every day, the same cycle. Rinse and repeat. And while not usually an environment of fun or jubilance, it felt especially on edge this morning as the group discussed what they'd heard the previous night. Only it was different for Adrian. He hadn't just heard it, he'd seen it. However, he'd decided not to divulge that fact and let them speculate on their own. After all, what good would it do to explain that a creature beyond their understanding decapitated an orderly and then devoured the severed head? "I heard it. Sounded like people were dying," Sean said. "What do you guys think it was?" Jack wrapped his long arms around his chest and hung his head. The conversation, coupled with what he'd no doubt heard last night, were clearly upsetting to him. Adrian caught his attention and gave him a friendly smile. Jack noticed the gesture and returned it with one of his own. His smiles always seemed sad somehow. "Someone got out," Seymour answered, confident in his own assessment. "Tried to escape. Can't say I blame them." If only they knew, thought Adrian. He guessed that most of the patients in the ward would have been aware of the commotion that had taken place, but Adrian doubted any had witnessed what he'd seen. It was only through sheer chance, having his hatch knocked open, that he'd seen anything at all, and the violence that had unfolded stayed with him, replaying itself over and over in his mind. The orderlies, too, looked different today. Usually these men tried their very best to be intimidating and imposing, and if not, they showed outright indifference. But today they seemed a little timid. When one especially agitated inmate started to act up, the orderlies were much slower in dealing with him than usual. Instead of instant action, they seemed hesitant, looking to one another for reassurance before diving in. Adrian had to wonder if the thing from last night was still prowling around here somewhere. In truth, he was surprised that he and his fellow patients had been let out of their cells this morning, same time as usual. Surely if that thing was still on the loose, then they wouldn't have been allowed out of their rooms, would they? "I hate this place," Sean said, once again picking at the angry red scabs on his arms. The man's body was dotted with sores, caused not by needles, but by the continual scratching of his skin, clawing at an itch that could seemingly never be sated. And he constantly fidgeted as well, his left knee always bouncing, and his fingers constantly picking at something. Adrian had no idea how long it took someone to get through opium withdrawal, but Sean was deep within it and showing no signs of coming out the other side. "I've seen and heard some strange things in my time here, but nothing like that." "Could it just be that someone got free?" Trevor asked with a quiet voice. "Of course," Seymour asserted. and caused himself a little trouble, I'll wager." "A little trouble?" Sean asked. "Mild way of putting it. What I heard didn't sound like any man." "You'd be surprised at the sounds the mad can make." "The mad?" Trevor asked. "You mean people like us?" "I ain't mad," Seymour said, gritting his teeth. "So don't lump me in with the rest of you." "I didn't mean that," Trevor said tentatively. "It's just, aren't we all in here for the same reason?" "No," Seymour shot back. "Most of us ain't in here by choice. I don't wait around and hope for some miracle that will never come, like you. I was taken and thrown in here against my fucking will. Ain't nothing wrong with me, and I'm sick of being stuck in this place with the rest of you crazies. You mark my words. I'm getting free of this shithole." A smile formed on Adrian's lips as he realised that Seymour was just as scared as the rest of them. The source of the large man's anger now made a little more sense to Adrian. It was fear. Getting angry was the only way he could deal with his situation. Adrian felt a small sense of pride at connecting the dots. In another life, maybe he could have been on the other side of the fence, helping people in need instead of being one of the infirm. "Something funny, boy?" Seymour asked, venom cutting through his voice. Adrian stared at him, not wanting to back down, but not wanting to start any unnecessary trouble either. He shook his head. "No, nothing's funny." "Then what the fuck are you smiling at?" "Nothing," Adrian said. Seymour was used to bullying the rest of the group, who would all fall in line when confronted, as Adrian had seen with Trevor. But Adrian was the new boy, and he got the feeling Seymour was still sizing him up, trying to figure out if he was a threat to Seymour's alpha male status, or simply a follower like the others. Then there was Jack, of course. Seymour never bothered the giant, but then again Jack was always silent. However, Adrian got the impression the docile man was always listening. "I don't believe you," Seymour said, leaning forward and poking a fat finger into Adrian's chest. "Now, apologise, or I'll rip off your jaw." Adrian stayed silent at first, just wanting to defuse the whole situation. The orderlies may not be as quick to dive in today, but that didn't mean they would ignore this little exchange for long. "If you keep this up, we're going to wind up in trouble," he said. "Then wind your neck in," Seymour spat back, red-faced. "Can we just leave it before someone hears?" Trevor pleaded and looked around the room nervously. Seymour leaned back in his chair but still looked furious. "Apologise," he said to Adrian. Adrian cast a glance over to Trevor, who was looking back with pleading eyes. He then turned to Jack, who was still looking down at the floor with a sad, nervous expression. And Sean was pretending to ignore everything, instead concentrating on the sores on his arms, drawing blood as he picked at them. Adrian took a deep breath, then exhaled. "I'm sorry," he said, slowly balling his hands into fists, an involuntary reaction that he hoped no one noticed. Seymour's round face broke into a wide, self-satisfied grin, obviously pleased with the power he'd exerted over Adrian. "Good," he said. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again, boy." Adrian turned away, seething inside. Seymour had bullied and belittled Adrian, embarrassed him and knocked him down, and Adrian hated it. Seymour had briefly instilled in him the same sense of worthlessness that his father used to on a constant basis. And Adrian had to fight to keep the monster inside. He couldn't allow it to show itself again. Thankfully, the orderlies wheeled in the trays of food. Dinner time. It would give him something to focus on other than strangling that fat fucker Seymour, because he knew that giving in to those urges would be wrong. He wouldn't be that person. He would not turn into his father. So he let it lie. For now. Chapter 9. Brian Hodgson had been found living on the streets 3 years ago. He was the mental age of a child despite being 42. With no one to care for him or care about him, he'd been a prime candidate for Arlington Asylum. And while the notes did not say exactly how he was brought in, Thomas Reed knew that if the man had any capacity to object, it would not have mattered. Reed set the notes down and observed his subject. Brian was currently submerged in a tin bath, which was filled with ice water up to his neck. He'd been this way for over 20 minutes, with orderlies on hand to make sure he stayed inside the freezing cold water. Brian was a docile man, however, so the chances of him disobeying instruction were doubtful. His teeth chattered together as he drew breath, and Reed noted a blue tinge on his lips. Reed had no confidence that this treatment would prove successful, but wanted to see it through regardless, just to satisfy his own curiosity. That was one of the perks to Arlington Asylum. There were no restrictions over the treatments and therapies he performed, and he was given free rein to indulge his theories. Reed had worked in other facilities like this, and none, in truth, really cared for the patients they treated, looking at them as little more than objects to use for further study. But even those places had a chain of command and someone to answer to. Not here, however. Reed took out his pocket notebook and scribbled an entry outlining the patient's progress. Not that there was much to report. He was cold. Brian had never been a violent patient, and his mental capacity was something that, Reed felt, was just part of who he was now. Perhaps it was due to difficulties in the womb or a problem at birth that had affected his brain development, but it was nothing that Reed thought could be fixed. Still, Reed was not pursuing this line of treatment to see an improvement in the patient. He was more interested in knowing just how much Brian could bear, and if his tolerance differed from patients with other afflictions. Did his docile state mean he would willingly accept more punishment, even holding out until it killed him, rather than complain or fight back? "Keep him in for another 20 minutes, Reed said to the orderlies. "Then get him out and return him to his cell." Reed left the room and continued to the next. Today was the day Reed was supposed to be trying his second ever transorbital lobotomy, but last night's events, coupled with his lack of sleep and the non-productive talk with Director Templeton this morning, had meant he was not in the right frame of mind for something so important. So, he had postponed it. Not that it mattered. The patient wasn't aware of what was coming, so Reed didn't need to rearrange much. His next stop on Ward A was to see Patrick Evans, a man who had to be kept in a restrictive jacket due to his insistence that his entire body was crawling with maggots and other insects. The state of his skin from scratching in an attempt to free himself of the imaginary bugs was disgusting. Angry, red scars and cuts dominated his flesh. An earlier treatment Reed had sanctioned was to actually cover the man in bugs to see what he would do. The results were explosive, and he hit levels of frantic panic that Reed had rarely seen before. Since then, Patrick's default state of constant agitation was much higher than before that experiment. All in all, a rather pointless exercise. Now Reed was trying a different method, a treatment that had, at best, mixed results. Again, Reed held out little hope of any success, but wanted to see it for himself. He walked into the small, dark room, hearing the screams of pain before he entered. A single light overhead shone down onto the bald, writhing man who was strapped into a high-backed wooden chair. Wires were connected to his naked, malnourished body, and they ran to a trolley-mounted control box to his side that an orderly was operating. With each twist of a knob on the panel, jolts of electricity were sent coursing into Patrick's body. He shook violently as another shock was administered, and Reed could see the veins in the man's scarred neck bulge out through the skin. "Please," Patrick begged, barely managing to strain the word out as his body locked up again. This electroshock therapy had been administered intermittently on him for over an hour. Reed again brought out his notebook and jotted down what he saw. The real results would come after the treatment, however, and Reed had poor Patrick scheduled for 2 weeks of this, in 3-hour stints every other day. If he survived, perhaps he would be a changed man, and free of those bugs forever. Reed stayed with the man for a little while longer, watching his treatment and suffering with interest, but even so it was a struggle to keep his mind focused today. There was a constant, dull ache behind his eyes, and a terrible headache was brewing that he knew would, in time, turn a bad day worse. The men under his charge, the orderlies who worked and lived at Arlington Asylum, seemed off today, or some of them did, and he recognized that it was the ones that had been present for the previous night's events with that thing, who were not quite themselves. The only one who seemed business as usual was Jones, and to see him work, one would never imagine he'd been through such an ordeal as Reed had witnessed. After confirming that the electroshock therapy was progressing well, Reed left that room as well and turned to head to the next. Up ahead was a small cupboard used to house cleaning equipment and some old medical tools that were rarely ever used. Upon his approach to this cupboard, Reed noticed that the inward swinging door was ajar, and he could hear voices within talking in hushed whispers. Ordinarily, Reed would have no interest in the idle chit-chat of others. He didn't care enough about their problems to make it his business, but right now things were different. Reed slowed his walking so that his steps were as silent as he could make them, inched close to the side of the door without revealing himself, and listened. He heard the voices of 2 people inside, orderlies he assumed, and from the sound of it, both had been present during the fantastical and gruesome events of the previous night. "I tell you," one said, "they aren't in our control anymore." "Don't be ridiculous," the other argued. His was a much deeper voice. "This is why we're here." "To be killed?" "If that's what's needed, then yes." "Your life means that little to you?" the first man argued. "You know why we're here, and what we pledged ourselves to," the second replied. "Am I to take it that you're doubting your promise and your beliefs?" "It's not that," the first said. It's just nothing," the second man cut in. "We all serve the church, and the director too while we're here. If you give me cause to doubt your devotion, then I'll have to take this higher." "No, there's no need for that. It's just, last night I was terrified. Weren't you?" "A little," the second man admitted. "But more so, I was excited." "Why?" "Don't you get it? What we saw last night, and the other things we've seen here, it's all proof. Proof that validates everything we believe in. How can we doubt the church now?" I guess," the first man said. "Keep your faith, brother, and all will be well. Now let's go. I need to assist that idiot Dr. Reed today." "Do you think he'll come to see the truth?" "Perhaps. If not, then he may end up like his predecessor." "Or worse," the first man said, with an actual hint of humour. They both chuckled. Reed heard shuffling inside and decided he'd heard enough. He spun on his heels and, as quickly as possible without making a sound, moved back down the corridor and rounded the corner. When he was out of sight, Reed leaned against the wall and tried to make sense of what he'd just heard. The church. It didn't sound like they were talking about any religion he was aware of. And a predecessor? If Reed hadn't felt in enough trouble after seeing that creature last night, it now seemed that this whole facility was wrapped up in something very strange. Enough was enough. He was going to get to the bottom of it all. And he was going to do it now. Chapter 10. After lunch, more grey slop that tasted of nothing, Adrian was tempted to go back to his cell for the remainder of the day, if only to keep away from Seymour. The fat man seemed pleased to learn that Adrian, like the rest of the group, would bend to his will, leaving him as the sole alpha in charge. "Worst thing about this place?" Seymour asked to no one in particular, just enjoying holding court. "No women. Men everywhere. Wall-to-wall cock. Man like me, he needs the attention of a lady." Trevor winced at this. Adrian sensed this was not a conversation the meek man wanted to have, and he knew it was Trevor's relationship with a certain woman that had landed him in Arlington Asylum in the first place. "Sean," Seymour said, keen to engage the rest of his little flock. "Do you know what I'm saying with this? You missed the touch of a woman as well?" Sean nodded, but did not look up from his work, peeling the skin from an angry sore on his arm. "Come on, man. Give me something back. What's your favourite thing to do with a woman?" Sean just shrugged. "Don't know." "What do you mean you don't know? You must know. Their tits. Or do you go straight to the good stuff?" Sean didn't answer. "Have you even been with a woman, boy?" Seymour asked, clearly enjoying tormenting Sean and making everyone uncomfortable. Sean again did not answer. "Don't tell me men are more your thing, because that would explain why you're here. Is that it? You a fan of cock?" Sean shook his head. "No." "Good," Seymour replied. "So, answer me. Tell me some of your conquests. We need to do something to pass the time here." "I don't want to, Seymour," Sean said. Seymour's eyes opened wide in realization. You don't have any, do you?" He let out a big, full-on belly laugh, and Sean's face flushed. "You've never even tasted a woman, have you? That is pitiful. Jesus, what is it with you? That poison you pump into your veins make you limp? Pathetic worm." Seymour wiped a tear away from his eye. "Unbelievable. Now, I'll tell you what really gets me going," he said as he leaned in close, and his voice took on a sinister tone. "When she doesn't want it, she'll try to fight back, but that won't help her any. You just force it, you see. Split her in two. Nothing like that sense of power." He chuckled, and Adrian's already low opinion of the hideous man now dropped even farther. He felt a surge of anger grip him, and his thoughts were cast back to his mother and the things she suffered at the hands of his father. When Adrian looked over to Seymour, that was who he saw. The anger rose, and he knew he could not control it. Then Trevor let out a chuckle. "You like to talk, don't you, fat man?" His voice was different from normal. Though he was usually weak and timid, he now sounded insidious and more feminine. They all turned to face him and saw a dead, hollow smile on Trevor's face. Adrian held his breath. It looked like Mother was here. "Shit," Sean muttered. Trevor flipping personalities was the last thing they needed right now. "Hello, boys," Trevor said. Adrian had seen this before, and he knew that Trevor was adopting the personality of the woman who had traumatized him so much of his life. "What have I missed?" Trevor asked. No one said anything, not daring to make a sound. Trevor turned to Sean. "How about you? Are you going to show some manners and answer me? Or are you thinking about when you can get your hands on more of that sweet opium? I have news for you, you pathetic worm. That ain't ever happening." Sean looked away, so Trevor instead turned to Jack. "And you, still with us, big fella? Or are you away with the fairies again? Like Sean, Jack stayed silent, so Trevor turned to Seymour. And what about you, fat boy? Cat got your tongue. Care to tell us more of your stories of conquest and of the woman you forced yourself onto? Seymour followed suit and said nothing either. Usually so quick to anger, even he did not want to provoke what Trevor had become. Adrian then noticed Trevor's gaze fall on him, just as an orderly walked over to them. Come on, Adrian. Don't let me down. Someone here must be man enough to let me play with them. You're the worst of all, aren't you? Filthy little monster, just like your father. What do you say to that? Adrian wanted to say a lot, but he knew that Trevor, or this version of Trevor, was goading him, trying to provoke him into talking back, because once you spoke back to Mother, that's when the trouble really started. So Adrian, like the rest, stayed silent. Pathetic, Trevor said. What's going on here? The orderly demanded, now standing beside them. This was not going to end well. Well, who is this? Trevor asked, turning to look up at the orderly. None of your fucking business, the orderly replied. He was tall, with black hair slicked over to one side. The man brought up his cosh under the jaw of Trevor. Understand? Trevor chuckled. Well, someone needs to learn some manners, don't they? And that was it. Trevor leapt up out of his seat with frightening quickness and clung to the orderly like a lion tackling a gazelle. And like a lion, Trevor bit down on the screaming orderly's face. They both tumbled to the ground in a heap as the noise level in the communal area rose, the outburst drawing almost everyone's attention. People gathered around as Trevor quickly got himself on top of the orderly and bit his cheek, pulling away flesh. A tear that ran with blood formed in the skin. Trevor then dug a thumb into the unfortunate man's eye as his screams increased. Trevor, meanwhile, just laughed manically as he went to work. It didn't take long for other orderlies to arrive and intervene, violently pulling the attacking inmate from their co-worker. Trevor hit the floor, and they descended on him with a flurry of kicks, punches, and savage whacks from their coshes. Trevor continued to fight back, but was overwhelmed. He screamed profanities and insults until eventually he was beaten unconscious, lying in a pool of his own blood. Two orderlies grabbed Trevor and dragged his limp body away as others helped their still screaming colleague, who now had a chunk missing from his face, the teeth beneath visible through the ruined, bloodied flesh. The other orderlies went to work on the inmates who had gathered, unleashing random attacks to push back the crowd. Whatever trepidation these men had been feeling earlier was now gone, washed away by this chance to unleash their frustrations. Adrian took an elbow to the face during the melee, and it was powerful enough to snap his jaw shut and send him sprawling. When he looked up, a brawl had broken out. Well, maybe brawl was the wrong word. It was a one-sided beating, dished out by the men in white uniforms who overpowered anyone daring to stand against them. Adrian got to his feet and stepped back, feeling himself bump into someone. He turned around to see Seymour. "Watch where you're going, boy," Seymour said. Adrian sensed an opportunity, hoping his actions would just get lost in the chaos. Without thinking, he lashed out and swung his right fist, connecting with Seymour's jaw, which gave a satisfying crack. Seymour's eyes opened wide in surprise, and he took a few steps back. That should have been enough. Adrian had paid Seymour back for the things he'd said earlier, for the way he'd made Adrian feel, but that one punch felt good. Too good. So it was not the last. He swung again, lefts and rights, battering the staggering man about the head. "You fucker!" Adrian said through gritted teeth. Seymour wailed like a pig. "Stop!" he begged in a pathetic, high-pitched voice. "Please!" His begging only made things sweeter for Adrian, and he pushed Seymour to the ground. The fat man flailed on his back like a stuck pig. Adrian dropped down on top of the other man and began striking him again, as Seymour tried to cover his face. Each blow was further release of the pent-up rage and misery that had been building inside. It was a purging, and it felt exquisite. The idea that this was wrong, and that Adrian was descending into the kind of behaviour that had defined his father, soon registered in his mind. Upon realising what he was doing and who he was becoming, Adrian stopped. Just as he did, he felt himself pulled away and thrown to the hard tiled floor. He looked up to see 3 orderlies surround him and instinctively prepared himself for a beating. He was not disappointed. Like Trevor before him, Adrian was kicked, punched, and struck with the brutal koshes. Pain bloomed in his ribs and the side of his head as the blows continued. Adrian did not fight back, knowing that path would only lead to more pain. The chaos continued until, eventually, all the patients in the room were subdued, and they huddled together in fear of more retribution. Adrian was hoisted up, barely conscious, and dragged from the room. Just as he reached the door, the 2 orderlies that were carrying him stopped. Adrian lifted his head, painful though it was, and saw someone blocking the way. Jones. "I'll take him," Jones said, curling his top lip. "The rest of you restore some fucking order in here." "Yes, sir," one orderly said. Jones leant in closer to Adrian. "Take it you've been causing a bit of trouble, have you? Gonna make sure you learn never to do that again." He then crouched down farther and in one swift, powerful motion, hoisted Adrian up to his shoulder with such ease it made Adrian feel like a child. He then left the room, Adrian slung over his shoulder like a sack of meat. "You're in for a world of trouble now," Jones said, with no small amount of glee in his voice. Chapter 11. Adrian was carried from Ward B through the main hall and into a place he had heard of but was unfamiliar with, all the while draped over the shoulder of the large orderly. His view was obstructed by the form of Jones as Adrian hung upside down, dangling behind the man's back. Adrian had to turn his head to the side to see anything of the passing scenery. He knew he was heading to isolation. Like so many other areas of the building, the walls here were tiled up to head height, this time a dull white, before bare plaster took over up to the high, arched ceilings. The floor added a little more flavour to the decor, with interlocking diamond-shaped cream and burgundy tiles. Adrian's head was already spinning from the beating he'd taken, and the pattern of the floor only served to increase his nausea, so he closed his eyes until Jones stopped walking. They had reached their destination. Jones opened a blank door with a closed viewing hatch and tossed Adrian inside like a sack of discarded meat. Thankfully, the floor was soft, and as he fell onto it, Adrian realized it was padded, as were the walls. A single bright bulb overhead illuminated the area with a sharp light that spilled down the white padding to the walls that were streaked with yellow and dark brown stains. Adrian also noted that the room had a foul, sour smell to it. Jones entered and pulled the door closed, sealing them both inside. "Your friend is next door," he said, nodding his head to the left-hand wall of the room. "The one that thinks he's a woman. He ain't awake yet, but when he comes to, I'll take pleasure in giving him a good going over. But until then..." Jones then took a heavy step forward and grabbed Adrian by the throat, heaving him to his feet. Adrian again braced himself for whatever pain was about to come, and even though Jones was only one man, the power and ferocity of his first punch was a shock. As the punch crashed against his cheek, Adrian felt a split form in his gum as a tooth dislodged. A sharp pain spread through his jawbone, and Adrian let out a cry as his vision spun. Another punch, this one to his gut, winded Adrian, and he bent double and coughed as he struggled to regain his breath. Jones released his hold on Adrian's throat and allowed him to drop to his knees.
"Now, I need you to remember the pain you're feeling," Jones said in his deep, gravelly voice. "See, I can't have people acting up in here. We need to maintain order so that the masses fall in line. And do you know the best way to maintain order?" Adrian let out another cry as Jones stepped down atop his left hand, which was splayed flat on the floor. The bone of Adrian's knuckle was pinned in an agonizing position beneath the heavy boot of the orderly. "By making sure people like you know what the punishment is for stepping out of line. I want you to tell your friends about what's happening to you here today. I want you to tell them every detail. Then maybe little outbreaks like the one we had today won't happen."
Jones reached down and pulled Adrian to his feet, bringing them both face to face. Adrian swayed unsteadily in the man's grip.
"But if not, then I'm still happy, and I'll let you in on a little secret as to why."
He pulled Adrian in close, and Adrian felt Jones's breath on his ear as the orderly whispered to him.
"Because I really, really enjoy doing this."
Two large hands suddenly gripped the sides of Adrian's head as Jones unleashed a savage headbutt to the bridge of Adrian's nose. He heard an audible crack, and the agony erupted all over his face.
"Stop!"
Adrian pleaded, feeling the blood flow from his nostrils and over his lips. The pain continued to grow and throb.
"Please."
Jones just laughed.
"Oh, I don't think that's gonna happen, inmate. We just started, and I'm just getting warmed up. Feel free to fight back if you think it will help."
Jones then threw Adrian to the floor and swung a hard kick into his ribs. Adrian screamed out again before the sole of Jones' boot found its way down onto Adrian's throat, pushing down and cutting off his air. Yet again Adrian was beaten down and belittled. When Seymour had done it earlier, Adrian had managed to get some measure of revenge. But here, with Jones, that just wasn't going to happen. He was forced to take whatever was coming to him. Just like he did as a child whenever his father came home. Sometimes drunk, sometimes sober. Always violent. Adrian hated it. The feeling of helplessness, of not being able to stand up for himself and fight back, of being forced to accept what was thrust upon him.
Adrian wheezed, "want to speak with..."
But then Jones pressed his foot down harder, cutting Adrian off.
"Speak to who?" Jones asked with a sneer. "Sorry, I can't make out what you're saying. Make yourself clear, inmate. Enunciate."
He laughed at himself and kept the pressure up. Adrian's throat felt like it was about to collapse beneath the weight, and the sides and ridges of the boot sole scratched and scraped at his skin.
"Director,"
Adrian forced out.
"Speak with Director Templeton."
Jones laughed again.
"Afraid you don't get to make orders like that. You don't get to decide when the director will listen to you. Understand?"
Adrian then croaked out one more word, hoping it would be enough.
"Monster."
The weight eased ever so slightly as Jones' expression changed. His eyes narrowed and his brow furrowed.
"What did you say?"
"Monster," Adrian choked out, finding it a little easier to speak now that Jones' foot had lifted a little.
"Last night."
The foot removed itself completely, and Jones squatted down over him.
"And what do you think you know?"
Adrian took deep, painful breaths beneath his words as he replied.
"In the corridor. A monster." "Monster?" Jones sneered. "I think your faculties are slipping, inmate. Fortunately, you're in the best place for that."
Adrian shook his head. "No, I know what happened,
and I want to talk to the director."
Jones also shook his head.
"Ain't going to happen," he said. "No reason for it. You've nothing of any importance to say."
Adrian narrowed his eyes and lifted his head, trying to sound as serious and assertive as he could, given his position on the floor.
"I saw it," he said. "I saw that monster, and I saw what it did to those men, and I know who it was before it changed. Now, get the director. Otherwise, I tell everyone in here what I saw. Think you can keep order if the patients believe vicious creatures are roaming the halls?"
Jones bent down and grabbed hold of Adrian's throat.
"You pathetic fuck," he said with a snarl and genuine anger in his voice. "You don't issue the orders here."
Adrian shrugged.
"Then you have a choice to make. Keep me in here for good, kill me, or get the director. If not, I go back and shout about what I know."
Jones punched Adrian again, driving his massive fists down into Adrian's chest, almost cracking the chest bone. But while Adrian rolled around in agony, Jones left the room. It seemed Adrian would get his audience with Director Templeton after all. Not that he had any idea what he was going to say. Chapter 12. Reed sat in his office, pretending to work on reports in solitude, but instead paying close attention to the corridor outside. The wooden door to his room had a pane of glass across the top half, allowing a clear view into the hallway. If he stood close to the door, he would be able to see Templeton's office farther down the hall. But right now, he knew that Templeton was in his office, so he had to wait for his opportunity to act. Reed heard footsteps outside again and saw the large brute Jones come storming past his door. The man looked angry, more so than usual. Reed got to his feet and approached one of his bookcases, angling himself so he could see through the pane of glass in the door. From this position, he watched as Jones walked up to Templeton's office and banged on the door. Templeton appeared, and the two spoke. Jones seemed to be agitated, gesturing animatedly with his hands. However, they were too far away for Reed to hear anything of what was said. Not that it mattered. Reed just wanted Templeton out of his office for a while. He'd studied the director's movements that morning, trying to find any pattern to his behavior that would leave his office abandoned for a period of time. If no opportunity presented itself today, that meant waiting until the following morning when the director spent time in the chapel. The man had left his office a few times over the course of the day, but locked it each time, so Reed was also trying to formulate a way to get his key. Or a spare. But one way or another, he was going to get inside of that office, and he would find the answers that Templeton was so reluctant to give. Reed continued to watch as Templeton finally stepped from his office and pulled the door closed behind him, then followed Jones back down the hallway. However, Reed noted that Templeton did not lock the door behind him. Reed buried his head in a book, making a show of studying the words within as the two men passed his office. As Reed glanced up, Templeton gave him an unreadable look as he went by, and Reed found himself nodding in acknowledgement. It seemed the natural thing to do. Soon both Jones and Templeton turned a corner up ahead and were out of sight. Reed had no idea how much time he had to work with, but he knew it wouldn't be long. He knew he had to act quickly. Reed jogged from his room, not bothering to lock his door either, and ran down the empty corridor to Templeton's office. He quickly glanced around to make sure absolutely no one was present, then opened the door and stepped inside. Director Templeton's office was much different than his own. For one, it was larger, which did not surprise Reed too much. But the other significant difference was just how tidy and ordered everything was. His sleek oak desk had on it only an open ledger and a selection of pens all lined up neatly. A stained oak chair with leather padding was tucked under the desk, and the books in the cases around the room were all organized in alphabetical order, rather than jammed into any spare space, as most of the paraphernalia on Reed's shelves were. Oak dominated the room, not only the desk and chair, but also the full-height wood panelling on the walls. Even the bookcases were built from good, sturdy timber. The office also smelled of incense, reminding Reed of the chapel, and he saw a single wall-mounted candle on the far side of the room, beside a tall window that was positioned centrally. Outside, Reed could see the grounds run up to a high stone wall that closed the facility off from the outside world. A thick rug lay beneath the desk and chair, plush red, leaving the rest of the wooden floorboards beyond it exposed. But Reed did not have time to dwell on the details. He was here for a reason. He ran around to the other side of the desk, to the ledger that was practically begging to be read. It was filled with reports on the facility's day-to-day activities. Quickly flicking through the pages, Reed searched for something of note, anything out of the ordinary, or some reference to the mysterious substance Templeton was administering to the patients of the asylum. However, other than a few brief notes about how much of it was to be administered, he could see nothing that gave him anything to go on. Perhaps if he had time to study the ledger in more detail, he could find more. But time was short. Reed next looked at the desk drawers, but found them locked, much to his frustration. However, surely that meant there was something inside worth seeing. He continued looking and realized that many of the books that lined the shelves were not medical, but strangely, tomes on the occult and strange practices. Not the sort of thing one would expect to find in the office of a religious man who ran a mental facility. Then again, it was not the sort of place one would expect to find an actual monster, either. As Reed took a step toward the bookshelves, he felt a floorboard beneath the thick rug sink a little under his weight. It might have been nothing but a loose board, or it could be something more. He quickly pulled the carpet back and saw that one of the boards beneath was a slightly different color than the others, and where the others were nailed down, this one was loose. Digging his fingers around the edges of the cold wood, Reed soon managed to tilt the board up, revealing a small, dark hole beneath. And there, sitting in the hole, was a small, shiny key. Secrets upon secrets. Reed grabbed the key, already having an idea as to what it opened. He put it into the lock on the desk drawers, and as expected, it released. With no small measure of excitement and nervous energy, Reed dug through the drawers. He found many folders, and in one, Reed saw records of written correspondence between Director Templeton and someone named Cain Ainsworth. There was also, in the shallow top drawer, a thick, black pocketbook. Reed flicked through it, noticing the dates and neat handwriting within, and realized it was a diary. The private diary of Director Templeton. He knew he had something to go on here, and weighed up his next move. Did he stay here and look through as much as he could? That came with the very real risk of Templeton walking in on him, especially as Reed had no idea how long the director would be. The other option was to take something with him, steal it to review later when he had more time and privacy. That seemed the most sensible idea, so he stuffed the diary into his jacket's hidden pocket that was cut into the lining. He considered taking some of the folders as well, but they were larger and more difficult to conceal. If he ran into anyone on his way back to his office, he would not be able to hide what he was carrying. So he shut the drawers, leaving the folders where they were, for now. Hopefully the diary would shed a little more light on things for him. Working quickly, Reed locked the drawers and placed the key back beneath the floorboard where he found it. He flattened out the rug and made sure the chair was back in its correct place, the legs finding the corresponding indentations in the carpet fibers, and quickly strode to the door and looked out. Much to his relief, there was no one around. Reed then slipped from the room and pulled the door closed behind him. A brisk, uninterrupted walk back down the corridor saw him reach the safety of his own office without discovery. Once inside, and with the door securely locked, he allowed himself a moment to bring his nerves under control. Thieving and sneaking around in the shadows was not his forte. He was a doctor, after all, though he could not help but feel a little delight at his success. Reed then walked over to his chair and let himself fall into it. He pulled the diary free and looked at the cracked leather of its cover. "Now, Director Templeton," Reed said to himself, "let's find those answers you were talking about, shall we?" Chapter 13. While waiting for Director Templeton to show, Adrian took stock of his injuries. He ached everywhere and suffered acute pain in his chest, ribs, and even his jaw. He dug a finger into his mouth and touched his teeth, feeling that one rear molar had come loose. When he brought the digit back out again, it glistened red, coated in blood. Not long after his arrival, Adrian had resigned himself to seeing out his days in Arlington Asylum, suffering in this hell. Existing here was not a pleasant experience, as days seemed to mix in with each other, becoming one long, monotonous cycle of stupefying misery. But he was, in a macabre kind of way, comfortable with that. He deserved it. But now, given what had happened recently, he had to consider if that sentiment still rang true. He was, after all, here of his own volition, and he wondered what the director would say if he decided that he wanted to be set free. Adrian cast his mind back to his first meeting with Director Templeton, a moment when Adrian was about to do something rather drastic. After filling his belly with booze, using the last of his money, Adrian took himself down a dark alley in the bustling, uncaring city. The public house he had come from was a place for the lower echelons of society to gather, but with its roaring fire and friendly chatter was at least a warm place. What he needed now, however, was somewhere cold and forgotten.
You've made it this far. Nice. Time for a short musical pause. This audiobook is completely free, and we hope it brings you some joy. Let's continue soon.
Inside, leaves of color, pure delight. Vivid leaves, shining bright, painting gardens with their light. Amber tones of fiery blaze, leaves ignite in sunlit rays. Nature's palette.
Somewhere he could bleed out from this world unnoticed. With a blade tucked into his hand, he found a suitable narrow alleyway, which was dark and secluded, perfect for his needs. His body would probably remain there for days, unfound, but this dirty, cobbled corner of the earth was as good a resting place as any for him. Adrian walked far enough into the alley that no one passing by the main street would be able to see him. He leaned against the cold brick wall, slid down to his rear, and pulled free the blade from the shaving knife, dull and rusty as it was. He put it to his wrist and took a breath as he prepared to slice. "Things really that bad?" a voice said. Adrian pulled the blade away and spun his head, instantly embarrassed at getting caught in the act. He was confused as to exactly why it embarrassed him, but he quickly folded the blade away and tucked it into the pocket of his old, worn coat. "Who's there?" Adrian asked, struggling not to slur his words with the amount of alcohol that swam in his system. He squinted into the darkness to see the silhouette of an approaching figure coming towards him from the main street. "Don't be alarmed," the well-spoken man said, "but I see a chap disappear into a dark alley, holding an ill-concealed blade in his hand, and I have to worry about what his intentions are. I didn't see you follow anyone down here, so I assume you plan to do something rather foolish to yourself. Am I correct?" "Leave me alone," Adrian replied, in no mood for discussion. He just wanted to be left in peace to slice his wrists open and bleed out on the ground. "Oh, come now," the mystery person said. "What sort of man would I be if I did that? I have a feeling you're in need of help. Let me guess. Down on your luck?" Adrian just shook his head as the man came closer, stepping out of the shadows. He was advanced in years, with grey hair and a friendly face. He wore a thick coat, and Adrian could make out dark robes beneath. "What would you know?" Adrian asked. "More than you think, actually," the man said. His voice was friendly, almost chipper. "You could say I'm an expert in this field." "An expert in misery?" Adrian asked, not bothering to hide the sarcastic tone in his voice. "You could say that, yes." The man walked up to Adrian and squatted down before him. He gave Adrian a smile, one that attempted to be warm, friendly, and understanding. However, Adrian sensed the kind expression was rather rehearsed and not quite genuine. "I work with people who are suffering, people with nowhere else to turn. People like you." "You don't know me," Adrian said. "You don't know anything about me." "Well, that is only partly true, but I know you're suffering. A man tries to take his life in an isolated, miserable place like this alley. That tells me you're also alone in life. It tells me you have no one to turn to. Hence you feel this is the only way out." "It is the only way out," Adrian said. "It's what I deserve." "No," the man said firmly. "It isn't. You only think it is. And you only think that because you can't see any other options. But there are options, my friend. There are people out there who can and will help you." "People like you, I assume?" Adrian asked, and then he looked closer at the strange man and saw a white collar beneath his coat. "Indeed," the man replied. "I appreciate that you will be skeptical of what I'm about to tell you, but I would ask you to hear me out. In my work, I deal with misery and mental disorders on a daily basis. I help people who are suffering from, how should I put this, non-physical ailments. And I've developed a medicine that is, if I may say so, ahead of its time. It's showing results that many doctors around the world have only dreamed of achieving, and it's actually making people better, I tell you." "Wait, aren't you a priest or something?" Adrian asked, pointing to the collar. "I've never heard of priests developing medicines." "Well, now you have," the man said. "And this medicine can work for you. It can make you better." "I don't want to be made better," Adrian insisted. I want to be left alone." "I don't believe that," the man said. "I don't believe you've done anything so bad that you don't deserve a second chance." "You don't know what I've done." "Not yet, but I will soon enough, I'd wager. And I guarantee that no matter what it is you think is so heinous, I've heard worse. And I promise you, I've cured people who have done worse. You don't have to suffer with this guilt." Adrian studied the man's face, looking for some hint that would give him away, reveal the lie, but he seemed serious and genuine. "Come on," the man pressed. "Considering what you were about to do, what do you have to lose?" That struck a chord with Adrian. After a long moment of silence, he answered, "Nothing, I suppose." "Indeed," the man replied. "You come with me, and you have a chance at a better life. If I fail in what I'm offering, then you are free to walk away, and should you still want to, end things as you wish. In fact, I could probably offer something that would not hurt as much as what you were planning. It would be like dropping off into a deep sleep." Adrian shook his head, confused. Just what kind of priest are you?" The man held out his hand. "One offering you help," he said. Adrian didn't shake, not straight away. Instead, he rolled the offer over in his mind. Could it be possible? A way out from his misery? Did he even deserve that? Eventually, Adrian took the hand. "You won't regret this," the man said with a grin. "And allow me to introduce myself. My name is Isaac Templeton." "Adrian James," Adrian told him as they shook. Mr. Templeton widened his smile. After that, Adrian left the alleyway with his new acquaintance and was taken to a facility, an asylum, just outside the city, tucked away in a large wooded area. And so began his stay. During his first consultation with Templeton, in the facility's chapel rather than the director's office, Adrian learned that Templeton was the director of the asylum and that everyone here reported to him. Of all the people who could have found him in that alleyway, it just so happened to be this man. Was that luck? Or something more? Could it be that fate had handed Adrian a second chance? However, it didn't take Adrian long to detect that there was something very wrong with the people in the asylum. That was obvious of the other patients, but it also held true of the staff. After his first few days, it became clear that all was not as it seemed, and he seriously doubted that Director Templeton's promises would come to fruition. But then again, it did not concern him too much. This place would offer him a miserable existence, which was exactly what he deserved. "My associate here tells me that you wish to speak to me, Adrian," Director Templeton asked. With Jones behind him, the director looked down at Adrian from the doorway of the isolation room, but without the normal expression of warmth that he'd held in past meetings between the two. Nor did he look shocked at the bloody and beaten state Adrian was in. "Yes," Adrian said, still nursing his jaw. "He tells me you have something to say about last night," the director went on, then cocked his head to one side. "What could you possibly have to tell me that's so interesting, I wonder?" "I'm sure you already have an idea," Adrian said. "There was an attack in my ward last night. Happened right outside my room." "Is that so?" the director asked, clearly acting coy. "It is. And during that attack, the hatch to my door was knocked open. And do you know what I saw when I looked out?" "Enlighten me," the director said, taking a step inside the room. Jones grabbed his arm. "Director, I'd rather you—" "It's quite all right, Mr. Jones," Director Templeton said, giving a nonchalant wave of his hand. "I don't think Adrian here intends to try anything stupid." He then turned back to Adrian. "Do you?" Adrian shook his head. "No, I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're here for a reason, inmate," Jones said. "Attacking another patient is not something we tolerate." "Is that right?" the director asked with a smile. "Is that what happened?" Adrian looked away. "I guess so." "Interesting. I don't recall you being violent in here before. Did something happen?" "Doesn't matter," Adrian said. "I think it does," the director replied. "It matters very much. I wonder what caused you to regress, to become the monster that you're trying so hard to outrun." "I think you're focusing on the wrong thing," Adrian said. "I saw exactly what was loose in the halls last night, and I saw it pull the head from the body of one of your men." Director Templeton chuckled. "I'm sorry, Adrian, but it sounds like the medication has been giving you some rather vivid dreams. But you were aware that this could be a side effect. Quite frankly, I'm surprised you've let it confuse you so." Adrian shook his head. "This wasn't a dream. I was awake as I am now, and I know what I saw. I'm afraid you're mistaken. I can say for certain that there are no monsters running around our asylum, Adrian. If there were, would today just carry on as normal around here? Come on, my friend. Just think about what you're saying.
Where's Malcolm? Adrian asked. I haven't seen him today.
He's been moved, Director Templeton said without skipping a beat. Unfortunately, his condition was worsening, so we needed to relocate him to a ward where we could pay closer attention to him.
I don't believe you, Adrian said.
Director Templeton simply shrugged. Whether you do or do not is of no consequence. But I'm telling you the truth. Now, are we finished here? I have a lot to do today.
Adrian paused for a moment before asking the question that was playing on his mind. I came here of my own free will. What if I said I wanted to leave?
Leave? The facility?
Adrian nodded. Yes.
Is this a hypothetical question, or do you actually want to throw away the progress you've made?
I'm not certain, Adrian said honestly.
Either way, the answer remains the same. Given your recent violent outburst, I do not believe I could release you in good conscience. I believe you'd be a danger to others, so your request would be declined.
Adrian had expected that answer. You'd keep me here against my will?
Until you're better. Yes, the director said. Speaking of which, I think it would be a good idea to step up our efforts with you. We'll administer more medicine tomorrow, and at a much higher dose. He paused before adding, and I expect to see great results. But for now, I must be on my way. You can spend a little more time in here thinking on your actions, Mr. James. With that, Director Templeton turned and left the room. He stopped next to Jones and addressed the man while looking back at Adrian. Come along, Mr. Jones, the director said. I wish to discuss something with you. The door to the isolation room was closed and locked, leaving Adrian alone. In truth, ever since he'd first set foot into Arlington Asylum, Adrian had suspected that he would never be allowed to leave. There was something off here, but at the time he honestly hadn't cared. But now, after what he witnessed the previous night, and hearing Director Templeton actually confirm his suspicions, Adrian was conflicted. Any illusion of free will that he'd been subconsciously holding on to was now shattered. He was a prisoner here, and he would die here. Chapter 14. Director Templeton's diary was a find indeed. It started at the turn of the year, 1954, on the 8th of February, and from the way it was written, Reed guessed that earlier records were in previous diaries. In the first entry, the asylum was in full operation, and it made mention of a head physician, one Christopher Vine. 8th of February, 1954. Things are progressing well here. My one concern is Mr. Vine. Whilst his knowledge in his field seems second to none, he is a somewhat ethical man, which means pushing our patients to their limits is difficult with his involvement. Still, he is proving useful in helping us develop our methods, and it's thanks to him that we'll soon be able to administer the substance to patients in a more efficient manner than ingestion. Of course, he would not have divulged the information needed if he knew our intentions, but I was able to coerce out of him the best way to efficiently administer a foreign liquid into a person's bloodstream without causing unforeseen complications. He's also training my brothers, who accompany me on my mission here at Arlington Asylum, on his method, thinking it would be used for blood transfusions, though perhaps that isn't too far from the truth. As helpful as he has been, I fear his moral compass may provide a problem in the near future if we're not able to make him see and believe in what we're trying to achieve. That would be no small feat, as I remember my own reluctance in accepting the truth. Such was my ingrained and short-sighted way of thinking. I thought I knew for certain how the world and beyond should exist. Still, for the short term, we shall carry on as we are. Reed continued to thumb through the diary, looking for passages in the immaculate handwriting that could be of interest. It was not an easy task, as time was against him, given it was still middle of the day, and he had work to be getting on with. Not only that, Templeton would likely be returning to his office shortly, and while Reed had no intention of returning the diary any time soon, if the director discovered it was gone, Reed imagined he would be one of the first people questioned about its disappearance. He was prepared to lie his way through this, of course, and planned to keep the diary with him and read more tonight, hopefully undisturbed. But for now, he felt an urge to discover as much as he could in the short space of time he had. A number of names popped up throughout the various passages, and the former head physician was a constant presence. However, there was another that was mentioned a number of times. Robert Wilson. 15th of February 1954. I paid a visit to my old friend Robert today. Sharing the same space as him is always a somber, wondrous, and even frightening experience. To be in the presence of such a being, in whatever incarnation this could be classified, never fails to instill in me a sense of awe and a feeling of insignificance when compared to the entities and intelligences we know exist somewhere beyond our understanding. Oh, what it must be like to exist as such a being, to know what they know, secrets and truths about the order of things that we, lowly creatures as we are, can scarcely comprehend. One even wonders if perhaps, just perhaps, ascension is possible for us. My initial thoughts were that the notion was nothing more than fanciful hopes and dreams, but recently I've not been as convinced of that. There may yet be a way, not to worship a god, but to exist as one. And I often wonder what happened to my good friend Robert Wilson. Where is his soul now? And what wonders does he behold? To Reed, the diary entries sounded like the ravings of a madman or a religious zealot, which to him was the same thing. During his conversation with Templeton, he'd guessed the director's motives were in some way related to God, but after reading the entries, he no longer believed that to be the case. Templeton spoke of things, beings he called them, that could perhaps be conceived as gods, but not the God that a Catholic or Christian priest would worship. Regardless, it was all nonsense. But Reed was concerned that such fanciful notions were the very reason this facility seemed to be in operation. There was also mention of a church, and again this church was not one that Reed was familiar with. It seemed to be the organization behind the asylum. This facility was the church's operation, and Templeton was the one heading it up. 4th of March, 1954. The church has given me instructions to progress things, as demanded by the great ailing one. We are to administer more doses of what we've collected to the inmates here. The results should be interesting. Dr. Vine is also becoming more of a problem. I had hoped to bring him into the fold, into our family, but I fear his mind is not open to new possibilities, and he would, no doubt, strongly object to the real work we need to carry out here. Things will come to a head soon. For his own sake, I hope he can see the potential before him. Reed thumbed through further, and eventually found the entry he was looking for. 29th of March, 1954. It is done. Unfortunately, Dr. Vine could not accept the truth and would not be swayed, as I feared. So we had no choice but to act. Still, his expertise will be missed, and we will need to consider replacing him as soon as possible. While we'll be able to cover up his death relatively easily, I think the next successful applicant would need to be someone with fewer connections to the outside world, and someone who is a little more willing to push the boundaries in the treatments they develop. I shall begin my search. In the meantime, we'll continue administering the medicine to selected patients. The discoveries we've made in a short amount of time have been remarkable. Reed would have continued reading more if he'd not heard approaching voices outside of his office. He quickly slipped the diary into his desk drawer and picked up a file from his desk. He opened it up and looked at the scrawled notes on the page, feigning interest. In his peripheral vision, he saw Jones and Director Templeton pass by his door, stopping just outside. As the two talked, the director cast a look inside at Reed. Templeton seemed a different person to him now. Before, he was merely an old fool, a man who followed a make-believe god and had found himself in a position that was beyond him, someone Reed was using as a stepping stone to move on to greater things. He'd been a man Reed could simply manipulate and deal with until he was ready to leave Arlington Asylum behind. But now Reed knew that Templeton was something else entirely. True, he still believed in the fantastic and the impossible, though the creature from the night before was testing Reed's conviction on that. But Templeton was also backed by this strange group or organization which held the same beliefs. Also, it would seem that most, if not all, of the staff here were members of the same cult. And to top it all off, this diary strongly implied that Reed's predecessor had met an untimely end, and that Templeton was responsible. Whether he'd carried out the act himself or not, Templeton had the power to decide who lived and died here, patients and staff alike. And that was a terrifying thought. Jones and Templeton finished their conversation, and Jones strode away, leaving Templeton alone. He looked inside Reed's office again and gave Reed a smile and a wave. Reed felt a knot form in his stomach. He gave a quick courtesy wave in return, and the director headed back to his office. Suddenly, Dr. Thomas Reed felt like he was living on borrowed time. Chapter 15. A loud knock on the door of the isolation room pulled Adrian from his thoughts. "Stand away from the door!" a voice yelled, though it was muffled by the thick iron. An audible click sounded before the heavy door swung open. 3 orderlies stood outside. One of them Adrian recognized as Duckworth. Thankfully, Jones was not among them. "Get up," Duckworth said, brandishing his kosh. Adrian did as instructed, though his movements were laboured and lethargic due to the pain that radiated throughout his body. His jaw still ached with every slight movement, and a sharp, stabbing pain continued in his ribs. When he got to his feet, 2 of the orderlies swooped into the room and each took hold of an arm. As they restrained him and jostled his body, another jolt of searing agony erupted in his sides. Duckworth remained at the door, overseeing proceedings. "Don't try anything. Understand?" he said. Adrian just nodded in response, feeling beaten and broken. "Good. Now, let's go." The other 2 orderlies pulled him forward, and he followed without resistance. Adrian barely registered the trip back to Ward B, instead lost in his thoughts, struggling with his internal conflict. Did he really want to remain here at the asylum any longer? Was his need for punishment that great? Adrian had no idea how it was possible, but he knew in his gut that what he'd seen was real, despite Templeton's assertions to the contrary. And if Adrian remained here, he knew that he too would eventually end up like Malcolm, which was an irony in itself. He was desperate not to become his father, a monster, and he'd come here in the hope of avoiding that fate. and yet that was literally what he could soon become. A monster. He remembered the sound the creature had made. That laugh. Maybe becoming something like that was fitting for him, but he dreaded to think of what his poor mother would have made of that. Not that she wouldn't have hated him already, of course. After Adrian was dragged through the main hall where the workers at their desks barely looked up at him, Adrian was then pushed through into the corridor of his ward and released.
"Keep your nose clean, inmate,"
Duckworth said to him before the secured door was closed in his face. With nothing else to do, Adrian ambled back towards his room. Chapter 16. "Try to relax," Reed said to David Redman, who lay on a stainless steel table that came up to Reed's midsection. He was standing at its head so he could look down at the face of his young patient. David solemnly nodded, knowing something was going to happen that would change things forever. Reed hadn't outlined to David what he was planning to do, feeling there was little need in worrying the patient unnecessarily. David had been strapped down with leather restraints across his chest, waist, and legs to ensure he did not try to lash out and make things more difficult than they needed to be. Reed had postponed the procedure once already and, truth be told, wasn't exactly feeling like himself today either, so had considered delaying it again. After all, his plan of using Arlington Asylum as a stepping stone to propel him onto greater things now looked like a miscalculation. He didn't think he would be allowed to leave this place. Not alive, anyway. But then again, he had to keep himself occupied, and finally succeeding with this procedure was as good a use of his time as anything. 2 orderlies were present with him in the room, watching Reed as he prepped himself. Normally he would have paid their presence no mind, but now that he knew that they were all wrapped up in the same cult, if that's what it was, it made them more difficult to ignore. The small room was barely big enough to fit them all in, especially with the table that held David Redman. The walls were bare, and there was a single barred window on the back wall. Fortunately, the light given by the fitting in the ceiling was generous, and that was important for the procedure Reed was about to carry out. "Come on. Concentrate," Reed said to himself. This was important to him. A chance at redemption. Whatever trouble lay ahead with Templeton could wait. He needed to be in the here and now. Reed turned to the instrument table at his side. It contained only 2 objects, a mallet and a pick, both made from lightweight metal. He took them both in his hands and turned back to David. The young boy's eyes were wide with fear, and for a moment Reed could have sworn he was looking into the eyes of Elton Breyer, the person he'd tried this on before. The boy who died. "Everything will be all right," Reed said in as comforting a tone as he could muster. He then lifted the pick and brought it slowly down towards the inside corner of David's eye. For his part, young Mr. Redman was able to hold himself together quite well despite his obvious worry, and especially considering he had no choice but to watch the sharp point of the spear-like object as it dropped towards his eyeball. Reed heard the young man give out a whimper, and he felt the pick make contact. Reed then raised the mallet and braced himself. This was it. "Please," David begged. "Don't." Reed dropped the hammer and felt the pick slide into the socket with a faint squelch. Another tap and it dropped down farther. He noticed the eyeball bulge slightly in its pit, the same as had happened with Elton. Tap. 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 The pick burrowed in deeper, and David began to convulse, but the restraints held firm. The pick was buried in too deep to be dislodged by the boy's movements. Another tap, and Reed felt it. The sharp point had found and penetrated the brain. He just prayed it hadn't speared its way in too far. David began to moan as Reed set the hammer down and took a firmer hold of the pick. He gently moved the instrument from side to side, feeling resistance as the points scraped away at the matter it was buried into. Reed was working blind, but he proceeded carefully. David began to buck wildly now, and a string of saliva rolled from the corner of his mouth. He uttered a sound, but it was incomprehensible, like the babbling of a child. Reed wanted to continue, to scrape away more of the matter, and to know for certain that the connections to the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobes were severed. But that was precisely how he'd felt when doing this to Elton, and then he'd wound up killing his patient. This time, he would show restraint. If the procedure was not successful, then he would just try again. So instead of scraping further, he eased the pick from David's eye socket. A squelch sounded as it released, like the sound of a boot pulling free from mud. The patient continued to buck and writhe for a good 10 minutes, and Reed studied him the whole time. Slowly, the convulsions ended. "David?" Reed asked. The young man turned his gaze to Reed, and the doctor noticed a bruise already forming on the inside of his left eye. "Can you hear me?" David did not respond.